I want to share with you, it is a pleasure for me to share the afternoon with my longtime friend, Pat Ryan. I'm actually used to following Father Ryan. He usually talks first, and then I always find myself in the position of repeating what he's already said. So I'm delighted for the opportunity to perhaps turn the tables on him. And I told Dr. Friede that I have been reading about her for the longest time. I've been looking forward to meeting her. So I'm grateful to you for affording me the opportunity to do that. It is also, I think, important for us to focus on mercy, not only because the Pope has proclaimed this to be a year of mercy, but because we seem to be living through a political moment when mercy and aspirations to mercy are in short supply. So it's good for us to come together to rededicate ourselves to mercy. It's also, I confess, it's a heavy burden to go first. So I'm going to take the opportunity, rather than to start out talking about Jewish perspectives on mercy, I want to introduce some theoretical considerations about what mercy is. First and most importantly, the three of us cannot start talking about how our tradition embodies mercy and imply that the others are devoid of it. For instance, I could not assert or imply that because of the atrocities of ISIS, Islam stands revealed as an unmerciful tradition, or because of the Crusades or the Inquisition, the Christian tradition cannot claim the mantle of mercy for itself. And of course, my colleagues cannot point to, well, whatever you want, the settlements in the Palestinian territories or some of the primitive injunctions in Hebrew scriptures, and argue that the Jewish tradition is a stranger to mercy. We must recognize that kind of thing has gone on in the past and continues to be preached in many quarters today. But before we can talk about our traditions, I would like to lay down a premise. All of our traditions are mixed bags. Not just yours, whoever you happen to be, but mine too. All of our traditions are mixed bags. All of our traditions have strands that teach mercy and strands that teach the opposite of mercy. Each has moments in our history that embody mercy, and tragically, each has strands that embody the absence of mercy, even the repudiation of mercy. None of us can lay exclusive claim to mercy for ourselves or pretend that we have somehow incarnated it in our practice. Now, in this context, let me be a little more specific and deal with one particular piece of history. Just last October, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, that document from the Second Vatican Council that reconfigured the Catholic Church's teachings about Jews and Judaism. Prior to Vatican II, it was a commonplace to hear that there was a fundamental difference between the teachings of the Old Testament and the teachings of the New Testament. The Old Testament was focused on justice and judgment. The New Testament embodied mercy and love. There were even those who spoke of the God of the Jewish Bible as being wrathful and angry, vengeful and harsh, and the God of the New Testament as loving, forgiving, benevolent, and merciful. Actually, of course, this has more than a few overtones of the teachings of Marcion, and as all of us know, Marcion was declared a heretic in 144. But his teaching in this regard did seem to enter the bloodstream of the church, or the thinking stream of the church. And of course, there is a corollary to that piece of theology. If the God of the Old Testament is a wrathful God, then those who worship this God, the Jews, must themselves be a people devoid of compassion and mercy. And this teaching, too, became part of the inheritance of the church. We see it in pretty standard interpretations of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. And through the teachings of the church, this caricature became part of the cultural inheritance of the West. A case in point is a little-known playwright named William Shakespeare. His Merchant of Venice turns on the heartlessness of Shylock his bloodthirstiness, and his monomaniacal insistence on justice. Shakespeare writes with an assurance that he understands Jews and Judaism, though, of course, he never actually encountered Judaism or a real Jew, since Jews had been expelled from England 300 years before he began writing. In the climactic scene of The Merchant of Venice, Portia juxtaposes the essence of Christian faith with the essence of Judaism. The words are so familiar to us that we have to strain to really hear them. Frankly, if you listen carefully, they are probably even more invidious than you remember them as being. You all can begin this monologue with me. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven. Upon the place beneath, it is twice blessed. It blesseth him that giveth and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mighty. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above the sceptered sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute of God himself, and earthly power doth then show likest God, when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. I have spoken this much to mitigate the justice of thy plea, which if thou follow this strict court of Venice, must needs give sentence against the merchant here. The Jew, Shylock, is a slave to justice, while Portia is the embodiment of mercy, and her Christianity offers mercy. Though it should be noted that this merciful Portia will ultimately take from Shylock the two things he holds most dear, his ducats and his daughter, and she will have the daughter become a Christian. There is no escaping the contrast that is struck here, the justice-centeredness of Judaism with the mercy of Christianity. Of course, this is not to attack Shakespeare. Shakespeare was not unique in this. He was just speaking a kind of shorthand, making use of stereotypes and caricatures that his audience was well familiar with, repeating, as it were, what everybody knew. But Shylock and all he represented were products of church doctrine, and clearly echoes of that teaching lingered on in the church itself until it was in effect declared a heresy again in 1965. So in 1964, the idea of having a rabbi talking about mercy at a Christian seminary would have seemed, counterintuitive, and probably would have been regarded with some skepticism at best. So let us begin with the assumption that all of our traditions teach about mercy, and all of our traditions can inspire people to be merciful. And let us in particular set aside the Marcionite perspective that Judaism is a stranger to mercy, and that all Dr. Afridi and I need to do is just sit at Father Ryan's feet and let him teach us about mercy. I would introduce a second reflection on the subject of mercy itself. We're used to talking about God. The words will come trippingly off the tongue. He's a God of justice and mercy. Justice and mercy sounds so lovely as a phrase. But the fact of the matter is that justice and mercy, while they're both important concepts, and both of them, of course, are good things, they are not synonyms. In fact, they are antonyms. Justice and mercy are antithetical. And the question of how to balance them or how to prioritize them shapes the contours of all of our faith traditions. How does God treat sinners? Does God give them their just reward, treating them according to their deeds, as in the parable in the New Testament of the sheep and the goats, or most acutely in God's parable of Lazarus and the rich man dives? In the very powerful images of the day of judgment throughout the Quran, for instance, And paradise will be brought near that day to the righteous, and hellfire will be brought forth to the deviators. That's in the 26th surah of the Quran. And of course, in the whole Deuteronomic strand of Hebrew scriptures, or the model of reward and punishment after death of the Pharisees and the rabbis. So is God willing to give each one of us our just reward, or is God eager to forgive and take back, as in the more usual interpretation of the parable of the prodigal son in the New Testament, or the Quran 6:12? Say, to whom belongs what is in heaven and on earth? Say, it is God. He has prescribed himself for mercy. He will surely gather you to the resurrection day, of which there is no doubt. Or similarly in Psalms, but God, being full of mercy, forgave their iniquity and destroyed them not. Yea, many a time during his anger, he turned his anger away and did not stir up all of his wrath. In all of our traditions, God is described in terms of the attribute of justice as well as the attribute of mercy. Those two attributes counterpoised against one another. Each tradition struggles to reconcile those opposite qualities, and none embraces just one of the poles. One last theoretical consideration. We often use the term mercy and compassion interchangeably. But it is useful to remind ourselves of the difference. I can have compassion on the suffering of people halfway around the globe, though there's tragic little that I can do to assist them. Mercy involves positive action directed at someone for whom I have compassion. Abraham Lincoln may have had compassion for the families of all those who lost sons in that terrible war 150 years ago, but he had mercy on the deserters whose sentences he commuted. Compassion is expressed in adjectives. Mercy is expressed in verbs. Compassion is an emotional response. Mercy is expressed in deeds. Compassion is empathy articulated, and mercy is compassion enacted. With these theoretical ruminations as background, let me now share some thoughts about mercy in Hebrew Scriptures and in later Jewish tradition. The first appearance of the concept of mercy in Hebrew Scriptures shows up in the climax of the Joseph story in Genesis chapter 43, which really teaches us, I think, a double lesson about mercy. As Israel takes leave of his sons who are about to go down to Egypt to meet this man, whom we, the reader, know to be Joseph, but who they do not recognize as Joseph, their brother. As they prepare to meet this man and beg for food in the midst of their famine, he, Israel, expresses the hope that, quote, God would endow this Egyptian official that they are dealing with mercy. And then later, when Joseph sees his brothers, the text says he was overcome with mercy toward them. I see two aspects of mercy in this story. If the man they are dealing with was in fact just some Egyptian official, then for him to share precious Egyptian food with a band of Canaanite shepherds would have been an act of mercy. On the other hand, since this official was really Joseph, and the men standing before him, begging in effect for their lives, were the brothers who had been so quick to inflict grievous wrong on him, then the concern and longing that he felt for them, the willingness to transcend feelings of anger and hurt, are an embodiment of mercy on a different scale. Two different types of mercy in that story. So mercy in Genesis 43. But the real locus classicus of our discussion must be the great theophany in Exodus 33 and 34. There, Moses encounters God in the most profound way. From the beginning, this episode introduces the theme of mercy. The episode begins in Exodus 33 as God assures Moses, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy. The climax of this episode comes as Moses prepares the second set of tablets. God passes before him and makes the proclamation that Jewish tradition identifies as the 13 attributes of God. 13 attributes of God. You can count. God passes before Moses and proclaims, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth, keeping fidelity to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, but will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon children's children to the 3rd and the 4th generation. It's a remarkable episode. One of the things that makes Hebrew scriptures, in fact, so different from the religious text of Israel's neighbors is that it contains so little of what I would call mythology about God. It doesn't really tell us stories about God, except when we don't see God. We don't see God except when God is interacting with human beings. It doesn't really describe God. And yet these verses almost revel in that which is absent in the rest of the Hebrew scriptures. They deal with divine attributes in a way that the rest of the 5 books of Moses certainly does not. A constellation of attributes, in passing, that we hear echoed in some of the Psalms, Psalm 103, Psalm 145. But strikingly, when it talks about God's attributes, it does so exclusively in ethical terms. It's almost a disquisition on the subject of mercy and justice, or the balancing of those two qualities. And it moves us more deeply into a discussion of mercy itself in Hebrew scriptures. Just as people tend to assume that mercy and justice are interchangeable, it's often the case that people imagine that these verses that I've just shared with you kind of consist of a single divine attribute, reiterated with numbers of synonyms. But to appreciate the full sense of mercy in Hebrew scriptures, we would do well to disaggregate this proclamation. It begins with God passing before Moses, proclaiming the ineffable name, which marks this declaration as being great self-revelation, unique to Moses, who we are told knew God as no other mortal had or would know God. And then it articulates the attributes by which God is to be known. The very first of these attributes is the one that we translate as mercy. God is a God of mercy. So now we have the chance to look at biblical mercy microscopically. The Hebrew word is rahum, cognate to the Arabic rahmah, or Rahman, which begins every surah in the Quran. It's an interesting word, rahum. It's built on the same, Hebrew is built on triliteral roots. Verbs and nouns all are built on triliteral roots. It's built on the same triliteral root that forms the noun rechem, or womb. So mercy comes from her innermost part, and it is connected to the powerful emotion that a woman feels for the life forming within her. Though we are accustomed, some of us, to being disturbed that God is often presented in masculine terms, so often described in ways that reflect a patriarchal society, here, God is endowed with a quality that is associated not with masculinity at all. Mercy is presented in terms of that most powerful bond. Certainly, mothers do not regard their unborn young in terms of justice, or even in terms of compassion. That indescribable link more closely approximates a sense of identity, of oneness, of being at one with. Mercy becomes a kind of the oneness that promotes appropriate actions. Let me interject here, by the way, an interesting piece of gender reversal in Psalm 103. Where it reads, like as a father rachem, like as a father has mercy on his children, so does God rachem, so does God have mercy on those who revere God. So the womb generated mercy of mothers and of fathers. Mercy. And then there are those other attributes presented in this episode. They are akin to mercy, associated with mercy, and yet distinct from it. Examining the nuances of these other attributes helps us highlight what is unique and distinct in mercy. It is not the attribute which comes next. That attribute is chanun, which we translate as gracious. Chanun comes from the word chen, having grace or being lovely. It conveys a sense of finding favor which rests on a fundamental otherness. It is the grace in us or the loveliness in us that moves us to act in a caring way toward the other, or perhaps it is the loveliness in the other that evokes the caring in us, the favor. Either way, it's a profound attribute, but it's ultimately dependent on the difference between the two parties, qualitatively different from the fundamental sense of identity implied by rachum. And then next comes another mercy-tinged attribute, erech apayim, which we translate as long-suffering, slow to anger. Here, the attribute seems to depend on a certain degree of thinking things through, or self-control, a kind of holding oneself back from what one could do or should do in the face of some affront. Here the concept, by the way, of justice begins to suggest itself by its abrogation. Justice might demand one response from me, but being long-suffering, I think better of following the dictates of justice. This quality, long-suffering, is not innate or reflexive. It is the product of choices. So it does not suggest a connection that you don't have to think about, not fundamental identity, but a certain self-control. Then comes the attribute, two words in one, abundant in chesed and truth. Abundant in chesed and truth. I think truth needs no explanation. I could explain it, but that would take me over the time that's been allotted to me. And it's really not connected to mercy. But of course, we've skipped over the most complicated of the attributes, the attribute chesed. Chesed is a very difficult word to translate because there really is no equivalent for it in English. So yes, it is in fact often translated mercy. And I suppose in certain ways it conveys what we could call mercy. If we accepted chesed as mercy, it would certainly open up many, many more biblical verses for us to talk about, such as especially Psalm 118, with its refrain, Ki le'olam chesdo, for God's chesed endures forever. God's chesed endures forever. But if chesed means mercy, it would be synonymous with rachum, and thus redundant and superfluous. And we all know that the Bible doesn't waste words. So it means something like mercy without quite being mercy, in the way that rachum is mercy. Miles Coverdale, in the first English translation of the Bible, had to invent an English word for it, one which we still use, the word loving kindness. Loving kindness. Whenever you see loving kindness, the Hebrew behind it is chesed. Perhaps loyalty comes close to what chesed is, or fidelity. Scholarship has suggested that it carries a different valence than rachum. We are directed toward the word constant. God is reliable, dependable, faithful, perhaps steadfast. It may even be the case that the closest we can get to it has been suggested to us by that eminent biblical scholar, Dr. Seuss, who gives us in Horton Hatches an Egg, I promised you a surprising biblical scholar. Horton says, I meant what I said and I said what I meant, an elephant's faithful 100%. Horton did not have mercy on that egg. He was reliable, constant, steadfast, an attribute in the zone of mercy, but not identical with it. The remainder of the proclamation moves us in a very different direction. It addresses an issue that it does not name, but that we recognize, the issue of justice. And it meditates on the relationship between the quality of mercy and that unnamed quality, justice. God forgives all kinds of wrongs, iniquity, transgression, and sin. And then, in a bit of what I recognize as sort of internal biblical commentary, it seems to backtrack from that. Well, no, God does not absolutely forgive the guilty. And then some difficult words for us to hear. visiting the iniquity of the father on the children and on their children's children to the third and fourth generation. Can it mean that punishment continues through generations? Or does it seek to answer a question that any one of us could ask, but which is not presented in the text itself? What happens if a guilty person does not appear to have received their just reward, their just recompense? Well then, says this text, well then, the punishment is visited on subsequent generations. Either way, the idea is distressing to our more modern sensibilities, isn't it? Of course, it was distressing to the prophet Jeremiah too, who said, in days to come, people will no longer use the proverb, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the teeth of their children are set on edge. Generations of commentators have taken comfort in the mathematics of the thing. God's faithfulness to the 1,000th generation is 250 times better than God's punishment of the third and fourth generation. So it's not as bad as it sounds. And then there is the book of Job, which dissolves the whole thing. No matter what, of course, this is not a subject for our conversation today, so we've noted it, and now we'll move on. These verses do key on the attribute of mercy and its similar but distinct cognates, and begins to reflect on the complex and necessary balance between mercy and justice. The attribute of God that does not appear in this particular list is justice. God, the Hebrew word is, God is tzaddik. God is just or righteous. God has the attributes of tzedakah, justice. Also, another word, God is oseh mishpat. God is a mishpat. God is a doer of justice. Two words for justice, tzedek and mishpat. But we would do well to dwell on the distinctions between mercy and justice in order to get a three-dimensional picture of justice. We've already noted that justice and mercy really are antitheses. Let us see how that plays out in the Hebrew Bible. Tzaddik, the first word that I use means straight, right, what we might call a level playing field, the balancing of the pans of justice. Mercy imbalances the pans. Mercy ignores strict justice and treats a person in ways that justice would not demand. Mercy imbalances the pans, treats people other than what justice would call for. By the way, peculiarly, or paradoxically, I mentioned the word mishpat. Whenever the Bible says God is about to do mishpat, which we could translate justice, what is really happening is God is rising up to defend the rights of the needy, the poor, the widow, the orphan, taking care of those who are marginal and outcast, which seems to me to be, in many ways, the opposite of justice, and seems to me to resonate with mercy. I'll just note that paradox and move on. Back to the word tzaddik. Tzaddik is a word that gives us the word tzedakah, which usually means, tzedakah means charity, much like zakat, alms. And this suggests that giving charity is not an act of mercy. Not an act of mercy, but plain justice, or redistributive justice, if you will. It is what is due a person by virtue of the fact that they are a person. Mercy is the opposite of that. It is not what is due a person, but precisely what is not due them, an unbalancing of the playing field, if you will, to compensate for their disadvantages. And as we have seen, it grows out of a loving sense of identification. Okay, we've dwelt on this locus classicus of mercy in the Hebrew Bible. I don't want to give you the impression that is the only place where mercy is a factor. In fact, I would suggest that the entirety of Hebrew Scriptures is suffused with mercy. God's mercy, and no less consequentially, human mercy. How we are expected to embody this quality of mercy in our own behavior. Our mercy is an important strand in the Bible. As an example, I would turn to a section of the Bible where we would least expect to find concern for merciful behavior. As we all know, after Sinai, the tenor of Hebrew Scriptures changes dramatically. Narrative is essentially replaced by injunction. Immediately after the conclusion of the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, the next chapter begins with the words, "These are the mishpatim," there's that word mishpat again. "These are the ordinances or the laws which I set before you." So now we get ourselves ready to encounter the God of justice and the expectations for justice here. The laws and ordinances that I set before you. And of course, there is a good bit of that in this section. It is in this section, for instance, that we find the lex talionis, the rule of an eye for an eye. But in this very section, we also find injunctions that call us to merciful behavior, actions that overturn the expectations and the provisions of strict justice. Justice is tempered by mercy, for instance, in the case of the accidental murderer. Person has killed somebody by accident. Though this section is replete with crimes that can only be rectified by capital punishment, chapter 32, verse 13 tells us that if somebody kills someone by accident, quote, "then I will appoint a place where they may flee, cities of refuge," which we find mentioned again in Numbers 35, Deuteronomy 4, all of chapter 20 in Joshua. They're not to be dealt with in terms of justice, but mercifully allowed to flee and escape with their life. Chapter 22, verse 20 and 23:19 enjoin us to neither wrong nor oppress the stranger, the person existing outside of the Israelites' legal structure. Quote, "For you know the heart of the stranger," here's that identity again, "you know the heart of the stranger, seeing as you were strangers in the land of Egypt." A commandment repeated dozens of times, more than any other injunction in the Bible, including the command in Deuteronomy 10:19 to love the stranger. In the same section, chapter 22, verse 21, commands us not to afflict two other categories of the most vulnerable people, widows and orphans. Another injunction repeated over and over in the Bible, Hebrew Scriptures. 22, 24, 26 involves a complete overturning of strict justice. In conventional justice, if I lend you something, I am entitled to charge you some kind of interest or to hold some kind of collateral. And yet verse 24 demands that no interest be charged at all. Imagine. I don't know what banks would do. Well, they're close to doing it. You lend money, no interest. And verses 25, 26 instruct, quote, "If you take your neighbor's garment in pledge, you shall return it to him by sundown. For it is his only covering. It is his clothing for his skin. In what shall he sleep?" A similar disruption of normal financial processes is found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 6, which prohibits taking a millstone or even part of a millstone as a pledge. And it says, quote, "After all, that's a person's livelihood." In the section that we've just looked at, this section devoted to ordinances, mercy extends even to animals. Chapter 23, verse 4 and 5. If you see an animal of your neighbor wandering around, you have to bring it home. If you see the animal struggling under its burden, you have to help set it right. Clearly outside the bonds of legal responsibility, but acts of mercy that you cannot escape. Mercy is woven through this whole section devoted to ordinances, and it applies to every aspect of life. Every aspect of life, except one. In legal proceedings, in the courtroom. In the courtroom, strict justice must apply. It says over and over again, you cannot favor the powerful and the mighty, and then unexpectedly, and you cannot favor the poor either. That's the one time that the preferential disposition for the poor is overturned, that mercy is overturned. Mercy is mercy, and justice is justice. I can't hold myself back from one other injunction that seems to grow out of a commitment to merciful behavior totally at odds with normative legal expectations. If I own something, the word own is, of course, a good word. If something is my own, if I own something, it is mine in the eyes of the law. And yet, Leviticus 19 and many other places as well demand that if I own a field or a vineyard, I cannot pick up the fallen grain of my field or the fallen grapes in my vineyard. I cannot strip my vines bare. I must leave the corners of my field so that the poor, the orphan, the widow, the stranger can go into my field, into my vineyard, and avail themselves of my produce. To my eyes, that contravenes justice and privileges what can only be called mercy. The perhaps unanticipated, unappreciated, underappreciated thread running through Hebrew Scriptures, describing both God and the activities of people striving to be like God. That understanding of God as merciful continues in Jewish thought beyond Scriptures themselves. For example, Father Ryan and I were talking about Philo of Alexandria, a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher from Alexandria in the 1st century of the Common Era. He writes, God takes thought of those who live a misspent life, thereby giving them time for reformation, and also keeping within the bounds of his own merciful nature. God's mercy is taken for granted. The rabbis, often denigrated as exemplars of law and strict justice, tell us, you will find the, quote, good attributes of God are mentioned in the Bible repeatedly and in abundance. This is so in regard to beneficence, loving kindness, righteousness, faithfulness, redemption, mercy, blessings, and peace. The rabbis reflect on God's mercy to penitent people in terms that might sound familiar to people conversant with the parable of the prodigal son. Like Jesus in Luke, it is expressed as a parable, actually numbers of parables, of which I'm going to share just one example. The son of a king had gone astray from his father and had withdrawn from him a journey of 100 days. His friends said to him, return to your father. He said, I cannot. So his father sent messengers to him, saying, return to me as far as you can, and I will come the rest of the way to you. And of course, in every rabbinic parable, the king is always God, and the son, whatever our gender, is always us. And so this story is about us straying from God, and God, in God's mercy, eager to take us back. It is put more explicitly elsewhere, also in a rabbinic text. God says, my hands are stretched out toward the penitent. I reject no creature who gives me his heart in penitence. That is the meaning of the text. Peace, peace to the far and the near. To all who draw near to me, I draw near and I heal them. Many more examples could be given, but the hour is short. This should be enough. No less interesting is the rabbi's handling of the challenge of balancing God's mercy and God's justice. The rabbis speak at length about these competing attributes. They tell a midrash, another narrative elaboration of the Bible, about the moments before creation. The angels ask God, how do you intend to rule this world you're creating? The angels are depicted by the rabbis as not so eager to have God create this world. How are you going to rule this world that you're creating? God responds, if the world were ruled by strict judgment, it would be destroyed as a consequence of just punishment. If the world were ruled only by mercy, it would sink under the weight of its sins. And thus I will balance justice and mercy. Just as when you pour a hot liquid into a glass container, you mix both hot and cold liquids together so that the glass won't shatter. The rabbis were very sensitive to this balancing of two attributes, two qualities of God. Millennia before formed criticism, which I'm sure is not studied in decent circles, millennia before formed criticism, the rabbis were intrigued by the fact that the Bible primarily uses two different names for God. Sometimes God is called Elohim, and sometimes by the J name, which cannot be pronounced, and is read in Hebrew as Adonai. They suggest that whenever God is referred to as Elohim, God's attribute of mercy is in play. And whenever God is referred to by the J word, the ineffable name that is read as Adonai, God's attribute of mercy is invoked. Again, it's another way of visualizing this balancing of the two qualities. This balance of these attributes serves as the subject of what I think is a striking discussion, a striking piece of narrative in the Talmud. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yosei, how do you know that the Holy One, blessed be He, says prayers? Does God pray? Because it says, even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. It doesn't say in the house of their prayer, in the house of my prayer. Thus you know that the Holy One, blessed be He, says prayers. Well then, what does He pray about? Rabbi Zuta ben Tobi said in the name of Rav, God's prayer goes like this: may it be my will that my mercy may suppress my anger, and that my mercy may prevail over my other attributes, so that I may deal with my children with the attribute of mercy, and on their behalf stop short of the limit of strict justice. A similar account is given elsewhere in the Talmud. It says, for 3 hours every... Yes, you can see that the rabbis in the Talmud were much more given to mythology than the Bible itself. For 3 hours every day, God sits and judges the world. When God sees that the world is deserving to be destroyed because evil predominates, God arises from the throne of justice and goes to sit on the throne of mercy. It is this drama of balancing off justice and mercy which is acted out in Jewish life to this day, most emotionally, most strikingly on the holiday of Yom Kippur, on the holy day of Yom Kippur, the day that finds Jews most intimately involved with God, atoning for their sins and pleading for forgiveness. One of the liturgical high points on that day is the recitation of the prayer called Avinu Malkeinu, an implicit acknowledgement of the tension and an expression of the hope that mercy will triumph over justice. Avinu Malkeinu means literally, our Father, our King. The liturgy of this very intense day includes the litany of the Avinu Malkeinu, repeating the phrase, our Father, our King, over and over again. It includes such refrains as, our Father, our King, we have sinned before you. Our Father, our King, have mercy upon us and upon our children. Goes on at length. It is easy enough to take the phrase, our Father, our King, for granted. But actually, if you think about it, unless you are a prince or a princess, those roles are not synonymous, Father and King. In fact, they are antithetical. The king, after all, is charged to rule in strict justice. It is the father, the parent, whose heart reaches out to you, who is eager to take you back, who wants to spare you the consequences of your bad decisions. In short, the parent whose reflex is mercy. And so Avinu Malkeinu is not redundant or synonymous, but an expression of that exquisite balance with which God must rule the world. Too much justice, the world is destroyed as collateral damage of our punishment. Too much mercy, the world would sink beneath the weight of our wrongs. And so, on Yom Kippur, we come into the presence of God with the hope that God's attribute of mercy will prevail over God's attribute of justice, that we will receive not what we rightfully deserve, but on the other hand, what we don't deserve. Forgiveness, mercy, reconciliation, becoming one again, atonement, becoming one with. By the way, the rabbis hint that mercy will prevail. Remember that piece from Exodus, the Lord God, merciful and just. They include this as part of the Exodus 34. They include this as part of the liturgy. But on Yom Kippur, they leave off that last clause about by no means absolving the guilty, visiting the sins of the fathers and so forth, so that on Yom Kippur, the liturgy ends, the liturgical reading of the text ends with the words, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, period. Much more hopeful. To this point, I have depicted us as recipients of mercy. I just want to say a brief word about our responsibility to be authors of mercy. Implicit in Jewish teaching is the notion that mercy is not what you feel, it is what you do. If I may borrow a Latin term, the cardinal principle of Jewish life is imitatio Dei. By the way, in contemporary terms, it's interesting to note that the very first book written by the great theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel was a collection of poems in Yiddish called The Image of God, Human Beings. More classically, we hear it in Leviticus 19. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. The rabbis expanded this mandate to admonish us to engage in acts of mercy. God's behavior becomes a template for our own. The book of Joel says, whoever shall be called by the name of the Lord shall be delivered. And a rabbinic commentary on Joel asks, well, how is it possible for a human being to be called by the name of the Holy One? And it answers, as the Holy One is called merciful and gracious, so you be also merciful and gracious. Similarly, a commentary on Exodus chapter 15, which says, this is my God and I will adorn him. And the question is asked, is it possible for a human being to adorn God? And the answer is yes, by resembling God. As we read in the Talmud, as he is merciful and gracious, so you be merciful and gracious. More pointedly, elsewhere in the Talmud, we are challenged to be rachamim b'nei rachamim, merciful children of a merciful Father. A discussion in the Talmud translates this in very concrete terms. It rests on numbers of rabbinic midrashim, rabbinic stories about ways that God interacted with human beings. I don't have time to tell you all those stories. You're lucky. But here is the conclusion. We are to follow the attributes of God. As God clothed the naked, so do you clothe the naked. As God visited the sick, so do you visit the sick. As God comforted the mourners, so do you comfort the mourners. As God buried the dead, so do you bury the dead. And in a variant on this it adds, as God dowered brides, so do you dower brides. God's expressions of mercy must be mirrored by our own. In very quick passing, I want to note that wherever Jews have lived, those precepts have been turned into concrete realities. Every Jewish community, anywhere in the world, has created institutions that feed the hungry, educate poor children, dower indigent brides, attend to the health care of the poor, and provide proper burial for the impoverished, as well as educate poor children. Making real the vision of another biblical commentary, what message did the Torah bring to Israel? And the answer is, take upon yourselves the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Vie with one another in reverence to God and in practice of loving deeds. What this means in Jewish life is that theology is not an end in itself. It is a template for our anthropology. If we take seriously the idea of a merciful God, then we, the image of God, can be no less. If I may be so bold, perhaps every year should be a year of mercy. Thank you very much.